everything is constructed in a game. I mean, I think when we start talking about these things, there's no human physiology. There are no hormones and actual blood vessels. And, you know, people don't check their insulin in games very often unless it's a plot point. There is no blood and guts in a video game character. I mean, the Assassin's Creed bug showed us all. No, the characters are empty inside. No, really. They're just, you know, they're just avatars.
Yeah, you made a beautiful point on this with the Asari, right? The Asari in Mass Effect, that they're kind of androgynous, right? That they can be anything.
Well, they're not androgynous because androgynous implies
both elements,
you can't,
right?
It's still a binary gender system. And the thing about the Asari, they are a monogendered species, and it's based on amphibians, that some amphibians can flip genders if the population gets out of control. And so they look vaguely like tadpoles that are still oddly hot. I mean,
with gills and
with sort of the little guppy tail on the back of the Asari head, but you know they still bump and grind like a pro. The interesting thing about the Asari, and this is what I love about BioWare world building when it works. They take, okay, we are going to make, and I don't know where it started, but we are going to make a monogendered society. We are going to make a society where there is no gender. This automatically, any of the conventions, any of the sort of storytelling shorthands we have go out the window. They do something similar with the Hanar in that the Hanar have no sense of self. You know, it's this idea of submitting to the collective and the enkindlers and all this stuff. I shouldn't say there's no sense of self. They have a radically different sense of self. With the Asari, all the modesty guidelines that we have in our society are out the window. So the Asari have this maiden matriarch, I forget, it's a 3-part life cycle. And in the maiden stage, they go out, and it's the equivalent of guys sowing their wild oats in their early years, right? They just go out to find a mate because they can mate with anything. They basically use DNA strands as a guideline. And that is misunderstood by other cultures as what we would consider slutty. Right?
Promiscuity, yeah.
Promiscuity, when they don't have those keep women still and quiet so we know where the babies came from for patriarchal land redistribution, right? I mean, the whole reason that a woman's sexual behavior is relevant is because guys back in the day had to know if their kid was their kid, because their kid was going to inherit their wealth. And so it became very important that the sex lives of women were tightly controlled, because you didn't want some guy going in and usurping your family fortune through a paternity claim.
Right. Or from the male perspective, you don't want to invest in somebody else's child, basically. Same thing, right?
That's the other way of putting it. And that's a very practical socioeconomic thing. But the Asari don't have any of this. And so the breadth of character in the various Asari, Liara is a scientist, you know, what's her name? Arya Tulok is a mob boss. You have Samara, who I think is a glorious character. You know, she's got the boobs out to here, but she's almost a priest-like figure. Glorious character, older too. And I think that's really important in games as gamers age. We need to see more women who are older than the gamer, because none of us are getting any younger, you know. and guys, I think guys want to see the women they love represented as beautiful in games, because I know guys, they look at their wives and, you know, my husband and I have been married going on 20 years. And he still keeps saying, you haven't aged a day. And I'm like, oh, bless you. But the mind is playing tricks on you. But that's true. He's not BSing me. That's not his way. That's what he legitimately believes. And I think that that male celebration of the women in their lives should be able to carry over into games, which means we have to stop telling stories about women who have just, they're practically so young, they've barely been having periods that long. And, we tend to go back to that because you don't have to worry about offending anybody with, a perky bum and a nice rack if the character's 15. You dodge that argument. So we'll make her young and solve all the problem. I was still a C cup at 15. You couldn't even do that with me. Yeah. But, it's a dodge, and I think it's really important. The Asari bring that into games because they can't fall back on those gender roles. And, one of my favorite Asari is a bartender. And she's there, she's doing the whole, old movie where he's rubbing down the bar. Nobody does that anymore.
Right.
She's rubbing down the bar. What do you have? And her mom, her dad was a Krogan, and they fought on different sides of the war. And the last she heard from her parents, they were basically going to do a duel to the death, and she doesn't know who won. They could have killed each other. But it's this grizzled bartender, and they're totally using male cinematic tropes with these characters that aren't female, but look female to us. And the reason they're not female is in order for there to be female, there has to be a male. And there isn't. The Asari are just Asari. There's no male Asari. And this is the beauty of games, because if you were going to do that in a film, even if you made a CGI character, you would have to choose whether to have a woman voice the character or a man voice the character. And that automatically, and that kind of pollutes the work in that regard. But in this case, they've said, no, the rest of the world sees Asari as female, but there's no physical body there. The Asari are the Asari. It's not Zoe Saldana painted green to be Gamora.
Right. Which is a good point, right? And that's the beautiful thing about games, like you said, that you can explore these territories that you can't in other media.
Yeah, and you can speculate in a way that there's some great science fiction out right now and in all mediums. Don't get me wrong. We're in a second golden age of sci-fi. It's fabulous, but it's not speculative fiction. It's people using science fiction to talk about the political controversies of the day instead of let's do a thought experiment about a society that was like this and a society that was like this. And BioWare used to do that so well until it became the LGBTQ game dev house. And they're starting to sag under the weight of that responsibility in a way that I'm like, I liked it better before. I thought they were more overtly LGBTQ positive when they weren't overtly trying to be LGBTQ positive. And
like treating people as individuals rather than as demographics, right?
Yeah, and kind of questioning. There was this whole push. BioWare couldn't win for losing for a while there because you had people mad at them. They had any non-heterosexual character in that game at all. And then you had people complaining that the characters that were not straight were not exclusively gay either. And I thought that had some very interesting storytelling ramifications to me, because a character like, say, Liliana, I actually think Liliana prefers women in Dragon Age. She sleeps with men because she's a spy, and there's a benefit to that. But her sexual orientation actually does skew towards the female, which is more an accurate depiction of human sexuality than going, gay, straight, done. We've seen the studies. I mean, we know that sexuality is a slider, not an on-off switch. There's fewer people who are absolutely gay and absolutely straight as opposed to people who lean one way or the other. Now, unfortunately, society forces us to choose because can you get married? Can you adopt children? There's all these pressures. And so I think that when you get a character that's promoted as the lesbian character in Dragon Age Inquisition, or the gay character in Mass Effect or Dragon Age, that puts a huge amount of pressure on that character to be exclusively defined by their sexual orientation. It robs them of that intersectionality of Dorian is not just gay. He is also a highborn Tevinter mage. That matters. That's going to impact his worldview. You know, they cheated the Qunari so bad. Playable, you know, Qunari party member, yay! But they got so fixated on the Iron Bull being pansexual that he lost anything Qunari about him. Because the Qunari don't breed for love. They don't get mates and live happily ever after and make babies in a lovely family unit. You have the people you care about, you have the people you have feelings for, but then you're told who to reproduce with. They have a completely different idea of sexuality. So, pansexuality in a game where the protagonist cannot be transgendered, like, what does it mean that the Iron Bull is pansexual in Dragon Age Inquisition? Are we supposed to believe he slept with Krem? You know, the trans man who's in his party? Otherwise, that label means nothing. If you label your character as something but don't show it meaningfully in game, I think that's when people start going, no, you're checking a box instead of telling a story. And I think that's a completely valid criticism. I wish some people would just let their art speak for themselves in that way, because Watch Dogs 2 has a great trans woman character in the game, but it's plot relevant. You know, there's a reason that character is not just a trans woman, but a black trans woman in local government. You know, the character, Miranda, had to be that character. She could be no one else for the purpose of that story. And you didn't hear the massive uproar we've had on other characters, because gamers, first of all, they didn't get told that there's a black trans woman in this game. You should play it to be a good person. Right. They played it and discovered her, and she made sense, and they didn't feel like they were beaten over the head with it. Now, it's unfortunate because I don't think the marketing on Watch Dogs 2 actually served the game. Because I don't think that they got out enough and let people know it is a completely different tone than the last game. They tried really hard, but there wasn't enough, because it's hard to show gameplay quickly. They didn't let people know that, look, there's a lot to do in this game. It's a lot more like Grand Theft Auto than like Assassin's Creed, right? And that's sort of the benchmark of an Ubisoft game. How much is it like Far Cry? How much of it is this like Assassin's Creed? Because let's face it, they have two models, and there's a lot in common there. And I really felt like that game, the satirical element of it, didn't get enough credit. Because, again, people have to explore to get it. And I saw a lot of complaints of, oh, Watch Dogs 2 didn't deal with marginalization of housing in San Francisco. First of all, it did. Second of all, why is this expectation on the game? They were doing a story. It was a Robin Hood-style story about information privacy. I'm good with that, you know, but people look for things to complain about, and I can find something to complain about in every game. I'm a game critic. That's my job. I have to sort of not be slavish. There's no such thing as a perfect game. Like you said, these games are so big now.
Right.
People count the bugs, right? And I can't stand that. I think that Bethesda games are too buggy. I think that they can do better. It's one thing that, oh, somebody clipped, like in The Witcher 3, my horse kept standing on tents. And it was hilarious because that wouldn't happen in real life, but...
And they turned that into a joke, actually, you know.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, well, in the Gwent card game, whenever you have, what's his name? What's the horse's name again?
Roach.
Roach, thank you. Yeah, he always shows up on top of the house, right? That it's a joke.
That's funny. Okay, I didn't see that, but... Yeah, I started just parking my horse
Yeah.
on the tent because I thought it was funny. But
was cute,
that's not the same as being in a combat dungeon in Fallout 4 and you have to kill a set number of rad roaches and one spawned in the ceiling so you can't kill it and I have to reset the game.
Right, and then you're stuck.
Those are completely different types of bugs. And the game, the bug that Assassin's Creed got so walloped for doesn't affect your gameplay at all. It doesn't force you to reset the game. Those are the bugs I care about. You know, the ones where I go, ugh. You know, and I think that was also why I was
hope I saved my game. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why I was so down on The Witcher 2. The memory leak in that game was brutal. And it was murdering my PC. And to this day, and this is the trouble with analyzing games and reviewing games, it's very hard to do fast because you have to have an experience and then sit with it and think, am I annoyed because of the tangible details I think I was annoyed by? Or was my response to this game colored by poor performance, technical glitches, other things that are less tangible but are certainly, you know, if the interface is bad?
That's all part of player experience. It's good to tear those things apart. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's where we get into the whole inclusion thing with women. There's compelling evidence that one of the things they have found that is a sex difference in, and I want to be very careful with this because female typical brains do not mean all women and male typical brains do not mean all men. They're typical. More female brains work like this than more male brains work like this. And they found that one thing that is different in male typical and female typical brains is the way people explore and navigate space and manipulate three-dimensional objects.
Yes, I've seen those studies, yeah.
This is critical for game designers. If women actually interpret space differently, this affects how you build your maps if you want to have a substantial minority of a female player base. I mean, a lot of those games that have large numbers of women playing, like, you know, games like Destiny and Halo and things like that, it's not because of the story. The story's designed mostly for guys. There's enough inclusion, though. You can go out and you can explore, and you can be rewarded for interacting your environment. I have a friend who hasn't finished Fallout 4, even though she's been playing for over a month, because she just likes to collect things and decorate her little homestead thing.
Right. And that's a valid way to play, if that's how you want to play. Yeah.
And I have to remember that it's a valid way to play, right? Because my instant reaction is, no, you're doing it wrong. You're VATS and combat and energy weapons and super mutants. But that's the way I like to play.
Right, yeah.
And the whole point of open world games is I shouldn't have to do the driving stuff if I don't want to. I like some driving. Most driving in games drives me crazy because it's track memorization, right? I don't have to in a lot of those open world games. I can play them, do the bare minimum, yay, got the thing I need to advance on, never touching it again. Other people may love it. You know, other people may absolutely adore Sarah as a romance option in Dragon Age Inquisition. I despise that character. Cannot stand her. Reminds me of, you know, she is the girl you were afraid to date when you were exploring any sort of same-sex attraction in school. The alarms just go off. And her whole worldview, everything like that. I'm like, oh God, no, women like that are why I didn't become gay. You know, it's kind of joke, like, no. Other people find a real affinity for that character. That's great. I still think she's a stereotype. I still think she's a negative stereotype about lesbians. Other people disagree. I don't have to have her in my party. I do find the chatter between her and Iron Bull when you're walking around, some of that's pretty funny. They do a whole "you stole my kill" riff that's really, really good. And I think people need to kind of understand that as long as there's something you do like, games are not designed for you to fixate on stuff you don't like, because that's the whole purpose of choice.
Right.
Like,
Well, I think it's healthy.
yeah, I mean, I think that some of the fight would go out of the whole Grand Theft Auto debacle. First of all, if there were male prostitutes, and not as many as the women, but I mean, there are male prostitutes in the neighborhood here. There are men who engage in prostitution. They are the minority. But if there are male prostitutes in Grand Theft Auto, killing a prostitute is not synonymous with killing a woman. It takes some of the charge out of it. I don't necessarily know that there's ever going to be a female protagonist in a Grand Theft Auto game. It would be kind of difficult to make that formula work, but...
And expensive, right?
And expensive. Well, they redo everything from the ground up, though. I mean, the prostitutes have evolved even from GTA 4 to GTA 5. They do some pretty interesting... I mean, there's some prostitutes that border on BBW territory in Grand Theft Auto, the new one, you know, and people complained about that. Oh, they made them look ugly. No, they made them look kind of realistic, and some guys like the fluffy girls. You know, they are actually appealing to that. And I was like, oh, okay, good for them. It's a small step forward, but it's a step forward. I mean, some of those encounters are played for laughs. I personally find them exceptionally uncomfortable because you're not actually having sex. And so the game stops while either the car bounces up and down and you hear, it feels more like your neighbors having sex than you having sex. Sex in video games is a difficult thing because you can do all the lead up you want, but there's no physical sensation associated with it. And so you tend to get dissonance the minute you have that physical encounter, right? It goes from being the character to watching two characters. It goes from interactivity to voyeurism.
It does,
very
yeah.
quickly. And that's why I kind of feel like the lead up, they should be more concerned about the relationships and build friendships instead of just pursuing people romantically. It would be great if more games actually allowed you to build friendships. I actually found the friendship with Morrigan in Dragon Age Origins more fulfilling than the romance, and I think they did that deliberately. You know, that moment where she goes, basically, she's never had a male friend before. What a poignant moment, and you only get that if you don't sleep with her. You know, and let's just be friends, Morgan. Oh, yeah, and it's Claudia Black who is glorious. You know, but these are the thinking outside the box of you have this very sexy female character, this sexualized female character. Her purpose in the game revolves around sex to an extent because of the ritual. But you do have the option to be friends with her, and there's a different payoff. And, you know, that's great game design right there, you know, and I feel like the later BioWare games have started to lose some of that. I felt like it was more, and I'm a bit biased here because I played as a Kunari because I want to play as a Kunari, and then I found out I was a Tal Vashoth mercenary. Robbed right there. They're setting expectations. You know,
didn't get to be what you wanted. Yeah.
They promised me an RPG experience, and I looked right at Mike Laidlaw and I said, Kunari, not Tal Vashoth, Kunari. And for people who don't know, Kunari are the adherents of a religion. The Tal Vashoth have forsaken that religion. They're the same race, so they look the same. But when a Kunari says, how many Kunari have you lost to the Tal Vashoth? The answer is none. They were never Kunari. And so I was going in wanting a role-playing experience where I'm able to play a representative of this very alien culture. And I didn't get that. I'm Mercenary 101. And I felt totally ripped off. And this may have colored my entire game, but also the most interesting romance options in that game were the ones that weren't intended to be romances. So they developed the stories and went, these guys are really good, let's put them in. But they were locked off to anyone who wasn't a human or an elf. And I'm torn on this. Because on the one hand, that's racist. On the other hand, people are racist. you know, and so it's this, again, that's that developer agency. I accept they have the right to lock off any option that they see fit. The problem is, as a particular character class selection, playing as a particular race, I felt decidedly limited in my choices. If you wanted to play as a female Qunari who preferred men, your choices were the guy who's lying about his entire identity. He's actually assuming the identity of another person, or the guy who lies about everything. That's not
much of a choice, really,
well,
right?
it doesn't. And if you're like, let's presuppose this is a game primarily made for men, because despite the belief about BioWare, RPGs still have a predominantly male audience, right? I mean, what you were saying about that is absolutely true. But let's say a guy is playing that game and he wants to play as a Qunari, but he wants to play as a woman. What is the game telling him about human men by offering that choice? Like, what is the game telling a guy from the feminine perspective about men? It's not showing a terribly mosaic approach in that regard. It's that all men are liars. And this is an unintended effect, right? But I can totally understand, putting myself in that place, I can totally understand why guys would have a real problem with seeing themselves through that lens and being told that's progressivism, that's social justice. Like, I can completely understand the emotional reaction there. I just think it's being, how do I put it? I think it's being assumed to be a conscious choice when it was really just an oversight in the narrative design process. It wasn't an intended message. It doesn't mean that message isn't there. It just wasn't an intended message. Does that make any sense?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. I think that happens actually a lot in games and game storylines, is you're exploring all these things that you think your player may or may not do, and you end up with loose ends. You end up with things where you don't think players are going to go there. You don't know what choices they're going to make, and it's just like bugs. You discover these things that there's been a lot of effort put into them, but there's not necessarily a political message there. It's more just like, what are we going to do with this? You know.
And I think there's a difference between a political message and using politics to inspire a story, right? I mean,
right. I agree with that.
I blame Quest for Glory, was it 2, for my affinity with cat people. Have you played that game?
That's going back a ways, isn't it? That's like a 1989 game or something.
You know how you wake up every morning and then you sit down and you eat breakfast, and then Shema, your cat person buddy, comes up. And it's this Arabian Nights kind of thing. And so Shema does this very sexy kind of belly dance. And I didn't know what a furry was at the time. But I've had conversations with people where I said, did that game make us all furries? Because that was oddly sexy for a weird little pixelated cartoon cat. But she was doing this whole thing. And I mean, obviously I'm joking, but those moments of vague discomfort in games, I really like. Those Nintendo DS games, like Fire Emblem Fates and all that, those games are selling like crazy. That's one of the underreported success stories in gaming right now is the software on the DS. They can't bring enough games over from Japan. They're stunned. They were completely caught flat-footed. And what do you see in women's hands, like girls' hands, more often than not, a Nintendo DS? And they're playing these yaoi games, and they're playing these games with these big, Boobs McGee characters where, it's this armor or this, all the things you hear them complain about. Girls are playing these things on their pink Nintendo DS, their pink 3DS. I'm dating myself with the DS. There is a real disconnect here about what our so-called experts say attracts women to a game and what women actually do. If women were so afraid of sex, if women were so put off by this whole sexual objectification thing, then when I'm out at pubs and we start talking gaming and every woman in the room goes, oh, BioWare, 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 what's the first thing we talk about? Who is your romance choice?
Yeah, yep. Yep. And I've heard that a lot. Yeah, people who play those.